Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to another installment of the NTC podcast. This is episode 52. Aaron Washington, glad to be back with you guys. Hosting this episode, my good buddy Colin is back for another installment as well. And I hope you guys are ready to geek out a little bit because we're getting back to the good old basics of the CBA talks in this episode. We're going to cover two very important topics concerning the CBA. The first of which being the whole idea of renegotiations and extending. Now, a lot of you guys might not know how this works, especially if you're not well versed in the whole CBA universe. But me and Colin are going to attempt to break that all down for you. Also, we're going to get into the whole opt-out deadline. The players and the league had a deadline set for yesterday that actually passed, and they agreed to extend that. So we're getting into that here a little bit later on. But Colin, I hope you're ready for another geek out session, man. I know that's kind of our bread and butter here.
Always ready. Always ready for that.
I'm glad to hear that, man. I'm glad to hear that. So it should be a good time. But as we normally do here before we get started with that, guys, we have the official betting partner of NTC with us. That's Bet99 Sportsbook. They are bringing you all of your primetime betting tools. So whatever you guys are looking to get into concerning the betting game, be sure to give them a look. Bet99.com is where you want to go for all that content. They got you guys covered. So, things are getting interesting. We got guys injured. We got guys coming back from injury. We have win streaks, losing streaks, anything you can possibly imagine when it comes to the NBA landscape. So check them out and definitely get involved with betting. If it's your first time or a veteran, they'd love to have you over there checking them out. So I think it's about that time, Colin. For this podcast, to start things off, we're going to discuss the renegotiation and extend method that teams have at their disposal to retain a player. Now, this is something we don't see very often. This isn't just simply an extending a contract. We see that pretty often in the NBA. A guy has a contract. He's in the last year of his deal. Hey, I don't want to lose this guy for nothing. Let me go ahead and extend his contract for however long it is, 2, 3, 4 years, retain him. He's not a flight risk. He's with the team. That's all well and good. Now, in certain situations, there's stipulations to this. You can't just do it whenever you want. Teams have the option to renegotiate a contract, an existing contract with a player, and then also at the same time extending that contract. So it takes the idea that we already know about extending, and it just kind of adds another layer on top of that. And we have a player here that's on a team that's surprising this season with their play. That's in a situation to where they can extend this player. Now, first off, I just want to let everybody know that in order to do this method, renegotiate and extend, you need cap space at your disposal. So this isn't a situation to where I'm going to go on State Warriors. I have 146 million or whatever it is, wrapped up in contracts, and we're in the tax bracket. You need to be in a situation to where you have cap space to use for this method. And this can only increase a player's salary. So this isn't a situation to where they have a certain salary, they're at 20 million, and you say, hey, I'm going to extend it, renegotiate and extend for starting salary of 15 million. That's not allowed in this method. You have to go to an increase. So it's pretty interesting how this works. There's a lot of stipulations. I'm sure, Colin, you can expand on this, but it's just kind of one of those things in the CBA to where there's a rule, and for every rule, there's about 10 different scenarios, or at least it seems like it, to where you can kind of bend the rule a little bit, or you can kind of duck under it or use it to your advantage somehow. So another point to keep in mind when it comes to this rule is that if you extend and renegotiate simultaneously in this method, his salary may not decrease by more than 40% from the last season before the extension. So it's just kind of interesting to see how this all works. And I'm sure you can explain this a little bit better here. But when it comes to the details of this method, like what exactly should we know when it comes to when you can do this, who it benefits the most, and some of the other stipulations and things like that when it comes to renegotiating and extending your players?
Yeah. So good job breaking all of that down. That's, there's all kinds of different rules and limitations as far as renegotiations and extensions. And, when we start talking about this, the main reason why I want to bring this up is because this is a huge benefit for teams that are under the cap space. Because like you talked about, when you're renegotiating, so the difference between renegotiation and extension is the renegotiation is you're changing terms of the existing deal, and then the extension, whether you're just extending or you're renegotiating and extending, you're just creating new terms, you're adding years onto that contract, the brand new years, right, with new salary. And what happens is under the current CBA, you are limited as far as your extension, as far as how many years you can add to an extent for the extension and the increase in salary. And that is what hampers a ton of teams that are over the cap and a ton of teams in general. Because what happens is the big rule here is that the next year's salary can only be 120% of the prior year's salary. So for example, if you have a player that's making $10 million a year and he's playing at a $30 million value or $40 million value, and you say, let's extend this guy now, you can't do that just based on that $10 million contract. The next year, you can only give him $12 million maximum, and no matter how much you want to give him. So what happens is the only way that you can kind of work around that is take that $10 million and increase it, right? So the only way that you're able to do that is by renegotiation. Okay. So what happens here is a team like Indiana Pacers with Miles Turner, which is what we were going to get into here, they have him at $18 million. Well, if they want to extend him right now, the next year maximum that they could give him is $21.6 million at that $18 million. You know, he's going to get more than that. But what they can do, because they have enough cap room, they have almost $30 million in projected cap space for this year, is that they could renegotiate his current deal and give him up to $30 million this year, and then extend that, and then extend based off of that salary, and then give him raises of 120% from that salary. So it goes from 18 million to $30 million this year. And then next year's salary would be roughly around $36 million. And then it could increase over time, the additional years. So what happens is it gives a major advantage to teams who actually do have cap room to be able to renegotiate and extend the players that they currently have on their roster. The difference is a team who is over the cap, they can't renegotiate because, like you said, the rule is you have to be under the cap, and after the renegotiation, you have to stay under the cap. Mm-hmm. So there's not a lot of teams that can do that. So the big limitations here is, and the big comparison that I want to make, say, take, for example, Jaylen Brown. He's going to be making $30 million on his last year next year. If the Celtics want to extend him right now, they can only give him, again, 120% the following year and then increase the salary from there on specific percentage raises. So they could only give him $36 million. Well, if he thinks he can make more than that, he won't take it. He's just going to sit and wait. So now they have to let him go to free agency, and then they use their bird rights as an exception to go over the salary cap to sign him. But now they risk losing him because he's in free agency.
Yep.
Right. So that's the major issue that you have, as far as you simply, there's nothing you can do when you're a cap team other than give them that max extension, try to give them that max extension. And if they think that they're above that when they reach the market, there's nothing else you can do if you're a cap team.
Yeah, that's the big drawback of this strategy, is that, we're going to get into this a little bit later when we talk about the whole CBA negotiations. But the fact of the matter is, in today's NBA, there just aren't a lot of teams with cap space, as you mentioned. Right. The Celtics, their situation is unfortunate. I mean, they're actually one of the biggest spenders in the league. So obviously they're not eligible to do this. But the Pacers, conversely, this is one of the benefits of staying under the cap. A lot of teams don't do this because if you really want to compete at a high level, odds are you have to go over the cap, even into the luxury tax. But for the Pacers, they've played their cards so well that they've both acquired a franchise talent in Halliburton, and then they also have a player who he's the longest tenured player on the team, Miles Turner, But I mean, the guy is like 26 years old. It's not like he's 30 and he's going to be past his prime. You're getting the best years of his career looking at his age. So if they were to do this, and it's kind of like a win-win for both sides. Turner gets that immediate raise on his contract for this season, plus he gets the long-term security of multiple years added on, which in this situation, I believe you can have up to 5, including the year that you're currently in your contract. So
Right.
It's 4 years after this one that you can be extended for in this situation. So definitely a benefit for, I think, the Pacers and for Turner. I think it's just at this point they need to still kind of explore all their options, because I'm not sure if they've 100% locked themselves into keeping Turner. I think this is one of the reasons as to why they haven't done it yet.
Mhm.
And that's another limitation of this whole renegotiation and extend, because of course there's got to be some other stipulation to it. But when you're doing this, it can't be linked to a trade. So you can't renegotiate and extend and pair it with the trade. You have to basically lock yourself into keeping that player for that time. So it's just something else you have to think about. It kind of limits their options a little bit, and it kind of forces Indiana to go to one of two directions. They say, we're just going to completely start over. We're going to trade Turner. His trade value is actually probably at an all-time high. Looking at his recent numbers, he's been absolutely fantastic. Or they say, he's the bridge between the past era of Indiana and the current one. Let's go ahead and give him more money, lock him in. He's not a flight risk, and they can benefit themselves in that manner. Now, you guys may have noticed that we're discussing players like Turner and Jaylen Brown in this because they're the most relevant players to the situation. This can't be done just for anybody. This can't be a situation to where you do this for a rookie contract player. They're not eligible for this. A two-way contract player also not eligible. So just to keep this in mind, this is usually going to be a situation to where you have a veteran and they're on a 4 or 5 year deal and they're entering the last year of the deal, that you're going to see the situation occur. And if they do have 4 or more seasons, they cannot be renegotiated until the 3rd anniversary of the signing of the contract. So they basically have to be going into a contract year to do this method, which creates another level of complexity because, as we've mentioned, they become a flight risk once you're kind of in that last year of their contract, especially if they're playing at a high level like Turner and Jaylen Brown have been recently.
Yeah, and the other part of this too is that the other way around this would be giving a designated veteran extension as well, which is a supermax contract. But of course, you don't want to be handing those out, and you need to reach specific eligibility criteria to hit that too. So we're really talking about your real standard veteran extension for these players.
Right.
And another interesting point too here is that the deadline to renegotiate a contract during every salary cap year is the last day in February. So it's going to be about 2 weeks after the trading deadline. So even for a team like the Indiana Pacers, they can see what they can do at the trade deadline, whether it's, they can see how they're performing still, if they're still, in the mix up to the trade deadline, or if they aren't, then they can unload Turner, or if they can bring on salary and make a run this year and then risk it, but then seek to sign Turner in the offseason. So there's a lot of different maneuvers that you can do, but at least you can wait to see what you can do in the trade deadline before making a decision as far as using that cap space before renegotiating.
Yeah, that's an interesting piece of it is the timing. Because with the way that the deadline falls, and you said it was the last day of February, essentially they're blocked from using that method of maintaining Turner between March 1st and June 30th, which is the beginning of free agency. So it kind of works on the Pacers' favor. Like you said, they have those 2 weeks after the trade deadline. So what I think they're going to do probably, at least if I were them, is I would play it out until about the trade deadline, because this is another point that I saw Bobby Marks bring up. He had an Instagram post, I think it was yesterday, about how often we see trades made before the trade deadline. And going back to his post, I mean, he was saying that I think it was like over 80% of trades occur either on the trade deadline or the week of the trade deadline. So I think going back to 2010, or I mean, several years in the past, there were only a few trades that had happened like at this point in the season, so like in December or January. So using that historical context, we can probably predict that if the Pacers are going to do something, it's probably going to be either at the trade deadline to trade Turner, or it's going to pass. And then in the second half of February, they use the renegotiation and extend to maintain him. That's at least my train of thought. And it just kind of makes sense for them to do that because of how the dates line up.
Yeah, or they decide, that they're actually in the mix, or they want to keep this core together and add to it, so they make a trade for another player that pushes them up against the salary, right? And then at that point, they can't renegotiate with Miles Turner, but then they use the bird rights in the offseason to sign him instead. But now you have another key player that you got in a trade that is pushing up against the cap. So now you can't renegotiate, but you can always sign him in the offseason or try to.
Sure. Yeah, that's probably that's another possible option. Of course, if I were them, I'd want to be fairly certain that Turner was going to stay with the team. Because, of course, if you do that, he's free to sign with anybody. And it'd be a big blow if you were to lose someone like Turner without any kind of compensation in return. So I could see them doing that if they're talking to Turner and he gives off good vibes to where he's looking like he wants to stay with the team long term. He wants to ride things out. Then I can see them doing that, especially if they're going to go out and, like you said, make a move to bolster the team, which that's another interesting, I guess, angle of all this. It's like, do they kind of build upon the success they have right now, not waiting until the offseason, not waiting until the draft, just going ahead and kind of doubling down on the great season they're already having? That's something else to keep in mind, because as of yesterday, December 15th, I mean, that was a big day for a lot of things, but primarily it was the day that most of the contracts that were signed in the summer can now be traded. So you have a bunch more options open up in the league now where guys can move. There's more trade assets on the block now as a result of that restriction being lifted. So that's something else we got to talk about. And me and Aaron, number two, because we're
AP.
Aaron and Aaron out here now. We covered that in the last podcast, some of the trade candidates, and that we didn't really discuss the Pacers in depth all that much. But I mean, it would be interesting to see if they were a buyer as opposed to a seller, because that's just not something we expected coming into the season. So
right, yeah. And talking about the benefits of being a team with cap room, which is rare for a team that's in the mix, is you don't have to match salary in a trade if you're still going to land under the cap when you receive the player in the trade, as long as they're under the cap. So if they have $30 million in cap room, they can get a $30 million player. They don't have to send out $30 million necessarily. Yeah. So that's another huge advantage for them too. So again, it would eliminate their ability to renegotiate and extend Turner, but they would be adding another huge player. And if they're already having discussions with Turner, they're already going to understand whether they're going to be able to either renegotiate with him and extend him or sign him in the offseason. I'm sure they'll kind of understand where that's going.
Definitely. When it comes to cap space, you see these teams a lot act as just a dumping ground for these contracts that age very poorly. We've seen this several times in the past. The Thunder, with I think it was Kemba Walker, was shipped there. They absorbed his contract when he was just like declining at a crazy rate. And I mean, the Pacers could be another team where they acquire a veteran. Maybe it gives them a boost in the short term for this year. He's expiring, but it's a big contract to where they can take it on without, like you mentioned, having to send out salary in return. So these teams are few and far between that have cap space, but they're so interesting to keep an eye on because of all the options they have that most of the teams don't have. The renegotiation and extend, the taking on contract without sending any out in return, just all those different tools at their disposal that just because of the landscape of the NBA, we don't see that often. So for people like me, people like you, those are the teams that are even more interesting than even the contenders sometimes because of that fact, because they have these different tools in their bag they can use at any given time. So
yeah,
cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's rare just because there's so few cap room teams, and then you always just assume that they're kind of tanking. So it's always just going to be an unexpected turn when they end up in the mix.
Most definitely.
Mhm.
So right now we have a very few amount of teams with cap space. We have a great number of teams that have no space even in the tax. They're into the luxury tax. This is a concept, it's an idea that's going to be revisited very soon, I'm sure, because we are approaching, believe it or not, I can't believe time has flown to this degree, but we're entering the very end of the current CBA agreement between the players and the league. Now, it's not actually the end of it. It's we're hitting a point to where the two sides had until, again, December 15th. I mean, that was just a big day for a lot of things, as I mentioned before. But it was the last day that the two sides had to basically make a decision on that. Now, they made the decision to extend that deadline to February, whether or not they want to opt out of the current CBA agreement. Because technically, I believe it runs until the end of the 23-24 season. But like we see with player contracts, there's an early opt-out option. So the sides have the opportunity to opt out of the deal and just scrap it and start fresh if they want to. We're not going to be able to see if that happens until at least February. I believe it was moved back to that point next year. But this is a topic that we discussed with Bobby Marks, and I highly encourage you guys to go look at that episode in the Summer League that we recorded. But we talked with him about what we think that the players in the league will discuss at the next round of negotiations. The tweaks to the salary cap system, this is a big one. I believe it's the league is in favor of pursuing the implementation of a hard cap system. Now, obviously, the players' union is heavily against the idea because then at that time, we're not going to have any more Warriors teams or Nets teams or Celtics teams where they're 10, 20 million into the tax and they're spending crazy money and that goes out the window. So it seems as though it can put somewhat of a cap on team spending. And then as a result, how much players can make, how many options they have to get paid. So obviously they're not a fan of that. So that's among several topics that will probably be discussed at the table. So Colin, that's definitely a big one. Any other topics of discussion that you think that the league and the players will have when they come to the table and try to hash all this out if they do decide to opt out, which they probably will here in just a couple of months?
Yeah, the other the big one that I heard, which I don't know if it's going to be a huge point of contention, is getting rid of the one and done rule, which is going to be really interesting to see if that happens.
Definitely.
So, of course, the one and done rule is having high school players go play in college or now the G League with the G League Ignite for a year before they're eligible for the draft, and moving back to being able to draft players straight out of high school at 18. So it'll be really interesting to see if they end up doing that. I don't believe that has been a point of contention for the players. The only reason I would think that it would be is, gaining more salary for younger players. It might hurt the veterans more. But over time, I would think that would just smooth out in general. But just thinking off of the top of my head, that would be the only issue that I could see.
For sure. That's definitely something else that it's going to be talked about. It's kind of crazy because this has gone back and forth several times. We had previously wasn't allowed, then it was allowed. Now it's not. Now they're talking about bringing it back again. So I don't know. I guess the league just can't make up its mind on whether or not they want to have this be a thing.
Yeah.
But
Well, it's interesting just having the one and done rule in general, because it's like, no, we don't want 18-year-olds getting drafted, and then they kind of just do a half measure to do that instead of, doing what the NFL does, or, where they have to be at least a junior or a senior. Just doing a one and done almost feels like a fake effort for whatever concern that they have over it. And that's just what I wonder is what is your concern, and how is making them go to school for 1 year changing that, having them be 19 instead of 18 and not getting their degree. I don't necessarily understand, especially now when they open up a team, the G League Ignite, to allowing players to go essentially play with the NBA, just not with in the association, but all the G League players, and a lot of the veterans. So It's really interesting. And it'll be interesting to see each side's take on this, because I'm not necessarily sure who benefits from what side, other than, again, splitting up the revenue. If more players are going to come in at a younger age, it might hurt some of the veterans.
It could,
because they're going to be filling those roster spots, right? So
exactly. There's so many routes to the NBA today, whether it's the G League Ignite, whether it's just competing overseas in another league, whether it's it's straight out of high school as they're discussing now. There's so many avenues, and I think it just creates an even tougher environment for scouts. Like I would be just overwhelmed if I was a scout right now, to be honest with you, because there's so many different sources finding players. And now if you add on top of that the opportunity for players to come straight out of high school, now you're trying to scout high school games. I mean, that's a whole other part of the equation. You're trying to get medical records for high schoolers. You're trying to get all this information. I mean, that's just such a challenge. So I'm sure for some parties, they're not.
But you know what? Don't you think they're already doing that anyway when they know that these guys are going to be one and done? I mean, they're probably already there.
It's probably already being done. It's just kind of like a little bit undercover, and now it's just going to be open practice to where it's just they don't even care anymore about trying to hide that. So yeah, I agree with that. But yeah, definitely a challenge. It's something to think about for sure. How about this? Another potential topic. How about cap smoothing? Because I'm sure you remember in the last time we had an influx of money in the league and revenue, 2016. It's something else we discussed with Bobby, just the fact that there was so much money that came into the league because of the new TV deal. And then all these teams were overspending on Nicholas Batum and Jan Mahimi and all these guys that just got, like, Timothy Mozgov.
Yeah. That one's like my favorite one.
The infamous Mozgov contract, man. Oh, my goodness. Just so many examples of this money being spent just because they have it, and it's not necessarily a good way to spend your money. Yeah. So I'm sure they're going to talk about that, because we're getting into a point again where there's probably be another influx of money because of new TV deals. So I'm sure that the league, that all these parties are thinking back to when that happened before, and they don't want a repeat of that. So they're looking at probably ways to kind of bring that money in smoothly, instead of just having a $20 million cap spike one season to create chaos.
Right. So. Yeah. And I would think that, again, this is another point that I think is just something that they just agree on the accounting for, because I think both sides would agree that it's fair. I don't think that the players want the few players who happen to be free agents that year to hit the lottery.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, why do those guys all of a sudden get to hit the lottery when the other guys don't? So I think that they would be on board with it too. It's just coming up with the proper system to do it, which is, you increase it by a certain percentage over time. And it seems like it would be pretty simple to do. I would think.
For sure. It seems like it would work a lot like player contracts work. So where you have that 5%, that 8%, and it's consistent over time. You don't see a player when they get a new contract go 20 million up and then it comes all the way down. Like, you don't really see spikes like that. Yeah. So I think I agree. I think it would be in the best interest of both parties to smooth that out. It's consistent over time. So I think everybody wins in that scenario. Like, no one really kind of misses out on money. You still get the money. Players that hit free agency are still seeing an increase in their salaries because the cap is rising. It's just not going to be to such a rate that it kind of just puts teams in a bad position to where they have bad money on their books.
Yeah, right. And that's what I was going to say too. It creates bad roster building, right? Because they do fire off all these bad contracts. And then it just kind of normals out, and you're stuck with all these teams are just stuck with these bad contracts that they're just trying to unload. Yeah. So it just makes for bad basketball around the league. So I think the league would agree to it, and I think the players would too, because you're still getting the money in the end. It's just coming, kind of like an annulment, just disbursements over time. So I think that would make sense. Yeah.
Yes, I would love. I'm so in favor of that. I'm sure that that's going to be something they agree upon very quickly, and they can just move on to the next topic. Now, players are going to get paid. We know that for certain. They're going to sign contracts, and the bigger time players, they're going to get their 4 and 5 year deals. The problem with that we've seen recently is that you have the Anthony Davises, you have the Ben Simmons situations, to where these guys, the Kevin Durant, to where now it's to a point where these guys get extended or they get a new contract within a year. They're ready to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I think that it's going to be looked at very closely, because the Ben Simmons situation, that was not a good look for the players. Anthony Davis, Kevin Durant asking for a trade before he even started his extension. He had a 4-year extension. He was at the very beginning of it, and he wanted a trade.
Yeah,
that's not something that I think the league wants to see. Is players just trying to weasel their way out. Hopefully it doesn't come across as disrespectful, but just trying to find their way out of situations to where they're under contract, because it kind of defeats the whole purpose. If you're under contract for 5 years or 4 years, even 3 years, and you're doing everything in your power to skip town, you're really just kind of you're hurting your team, because number one, I think that has a very negative impact on the locker room. And then number two, you're kind of pushing these teams into a situation where they're trying to find a trade for you. They don't want to be there. And then those other teams that you're talking to about a trade, they see it. This guy has 4 years on their contract left. And I mean, that's cool, but the teams trading him, they want a premium, because it's like, hey, this guy has 4 years left. I don't want pennies on the dollar.
right.
And those other teams are like, well, we're not going to be in a rush to trade, because, we don't have any kind of incentive or any kind of reason to pull a trigger right now if he's.
And your guy wants out. So why are we, you got to figure something out.
Yeah.
Right. So,
exactly.
Yeah. And it's true. It'll be interesting if there's some way to even legislate it in any way. It's going to be tough to do. But you're absolutely right. And in the tough part, I think where it's unfair, especially, is when a player will specifically max out their ability to gain salary because, they have their team exercise their bird rights, get this massive contract, knowing that, well, I'll just ask for a trade in a year or two, where instead of saying, this isn't the place that I want to be, let's do a sign and trade, or I'm going to go seek somewhere in free agency, and you're only going to be able to go to a cap team at that point, and it's not going to be for as much as you would have gotten with that team, right? So I don't know if there's going to be a way to be able to necessarily legislate that, but I'm sure that they're going to be looking at that somehow.
I just really think they need to at least give it a look.
Yeah.
And then even if it's
what would you think that they would be able to do as far as like being able to, because you can't necessarily tell them, well, you can't demand a trade.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's where it gets tough, because then it becomes a slippery slope as far as what you can demand and can't demand and things like that. Right. So
right.
I understand where you're coming from, and I would understand where teams are coming from as far as, hey, I just signed you to a massive deal. I'm making my commitment to you. You have to make your commitment to me. No question. But I just don't know at what point, other than sticking to your guns, kind of like the Nets did, and saying, no, we're not trading you. So retire or play for us. I mean, I'm just not sure exactly what you can do. I'm sure they'll come up with it. The league knows how to do these things. They're very good at it, but I just can't think of a resolution off the top of my head for that.
It really is tough to come to a solution for that. And I mean, I think that the league is going to be very driven to find one, because I'm sure in their minds, they think, and of course I'm speaking for them, I can't say for sure, but I'm sure they're thinking that players have so much power in today's game that they want to dial that back, even just a little bit. Because if these teams have that much power over a franchise, where they can basically kind of dictate where this franchise goes in terms of their development, in terms of their decision making, like, I'm sure that owners and they're not a huge fan of that. So I think that's where things get dicey. And to your point, I'm not sure really what they can do. I mean, I know sometimes this is not a perfect analogy, but I'm not sure if you're familiar with the car market right now with like new cars coming out, but you'll see something get released and it's like it's such a high demand and it's a low supply,
Mm-hmm.
and they get this vehicle and they're incentivized to flip it immediately. So they don't even keep the car, they don't even drive it, they just get it. They want to flip it for a profit. That makes me think of, buying, getting a player, using a money, whatever cap space to get a player, and then immediately they want out. So now these car makers are starting implementing a penalty to where if you try to flip the car within 12 months of ownership, there's a penalty. So they can't stop you from doing it, but there is a penalty to where if you want a new car in the future, you're blacklisted. If the person you're giving the car to, the warranty is voided. Like, they have ways to kind of dial that back. So maybe the league can do something like that.
Interesting.
To where if you ship the player out, the player takes some kind of hit. I'm not sure how that would look, like some kind of penalty in their contract to where they don't get their full salary. Just the first thing comes to mind. I know it's not a perfect solution, but
no, that's interesting. And it'll be interesting if they do something like that and try to work around it. It kind of makes me think of, in football with their how they constantly hold out for a new contract from training camp. And they started issuing a ton of penalties. And back in the day when they restructured it, they could just forfeit the penalties. They don't care and they can pay it back. And then they eliminated that because what was the point? They would still hold out. Well, now what they do is they just pretend they're injured.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the next thing. So it's interesting if they do insert some type of penalty. If the player demands the trade, then they're going to say they're hurt until they are traded. You know what I mean? It'll just get really interesting. It's always going to be a workaround to get what they want. Right.
There's always a loophole, man.
Yeah.
There's always a loophole. There's always,
and that's why they negotiate these things, right? It's negotiated.
Exactly.
And that's why you keep negotiating it. Yeah. But I wanted your take on, I guess we didn't really dive into our opinions on it. What's your take on the league thinking about a hard cap?
That's a good question. It's something that I think there's pros and cons. In today's NBA, there's so much spending, and the luxury tax has been good in kind of reeling in these teams that just want to spend extravagantly. So there's penalties on that, and even the Warriors are becoming a victim of that to some extent. So I think a hard cap would be a good thing in terms of continuing to bring balance between the small markets and the big markets. So if you have a cap and everybody's at a certain cap, instead of like the Warriors being able to go to $40 million over the tax, and the Pelicans are only being able to go to the tax or even under the tax, it kind of brings people into more of a balance, which I think promotes more parity in the league, which I think we're seeing that to a pretty good extent this season so far. I don't see one team just running away, except the Celtics kind of, and a bunch of teams just tanking. It's kind of like a lot of teams are in the middle, which is good. Mm-hmm. And I think it would help promote that more. But then, of course, on the flip side, the players are hurt by it, because instead of any team, like your team, I think it just kind of like shrinks the pool of teams that will be able to pay these players. If they think they're worth a certain amount of money, but it's like, oh, there aren't any teams that can pay you because there's some kind of hard cap there. They can't go into the tax or anything. I think it hurts them a little bit too. So pros and cons, we'll see. But I mean, I think it's going to be a tough sell, because I think the players are just going to be completely against that idea.
Yeah. I think that I understand where you're coming from. And certainly there's a discrepancy as far as, the salaries. Like when you look at the Warriors are kind of an outlier across the rest of the league. And most of them, once you hit that repeater tax, they always try to reset for the most part. So, I don't think that it's absolutely necessary to keep everything somewhat fair. But I do see where you're coming from. But the thing is, as far as the restrictions with max salaries and your ability to sign players, like the Warriors are so far over the tax because they're so good at drafting, and they retain those players that they drafted for the most part, and they traded for Wiggins. Exactly. That's and they're rewarded for that by spending their own money and keeping those guys. Mm-hmm. So that. And then at that point, they still can't spend everything that they want, because they still have max salaries that they can only pay these guys, right? True. So there's still so many limitations that I don't necessarily agree with the hard cap, especially like you said, when you look at the league how it is today, I think that it fits. The only time that it really splits up and becomes these powerhouses is when the players move and join super teams. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the luxury tax at that point. It just has to do, actually, players are for the most part taking pay cuts
That's
to go
true.
do a super team.
That's true.
And that's when the league becomes more unfair. So I don't necessarily think that it's necessary. I think that it's a pretty good system as it is, as far as setting limitations on what teams can do. At least when you are in the luxury tax, for the most part, it's because you're keeping the players that you want, that you did roster building, and now you're re-signing those players, and that's essentially what's putting you in the tax. And I think that's okay. Like, you're being rewarded with the ability to go over the tax because you built a good roster, and then you're willing to spend money on it. And I think that's okay too, and pay your players, right?
I'm with you.
So I'm not necessarily for the hard cap.
I'm not either. I think there's a place for it maybe in other leagues, but the way the NBA is structured, and you hit this perfectly. I mean, I think the main thing about this rule is that it would dissuade the whole super team concept. But I think it's that whole era, I think, is kind of phasing out in a way. You look across the league, and it's like the top of the West is the Grizzlies and the Pelicans. They're not super teams. You look in the East, and it's the Bucks and the Celtics. They're not super teams.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the teams that are closest to that, the Nets, the Lakers with multiple superstars, I mean, they're not at the top of the conference.
Right. Clippers are your best bet to do anything.
Yeah. And even they're not doing that great.
Right.
Because their two best players are always on the bench.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it's definitely not a huge problem in today's game. I think, there was a period of time to where it's like, okay, this is everywhere. So maybe at that point they were thinking about trying to corral it with the hard cap. But now it's like, is it really a problem? Like, I don't see it as a problem. And there's several articles out there that will back this point up, saying that there's more parity in the league than probably there has been in a long time. There's a lack of super teams because those teams I just mentioned, the Celtics, the Pelicans, the Grizzlies, they all just drafted great, just like the Warriors, like you mentioned. Right. They just did supreme drafting, which is that's completely opposite of building a team just strictly through superstars, which is it's just cool to see.
Yeah. And you look at the last two finals, and all four teams were built through the draft, basically. Yep. So that it's good to see. That's what helps this league, and that's why it's in such good shape right now across the entire league. And you look at what New Orleans is doing now. You guys talked about it last podcast. Yep. And that's how they're building it too. And they made good moves, but that's what you want. You want to draft your core and then build out on the fringes with free agency and trades.
Exactly. Yeah. That's how it's done. So the league is in a great place, and I don't see any kind of lockout happening. I think that's kind of like the end point of all this, where you have to kind of keep in mind is that there's always a possibility of a lockout if you get this close to the this point to where they can opt out. And if they don't come to a new agreement on a new CBA, you have that risk. Mm-hmm. But with the way things are right now, with the league growing and the revenue continuing to build, the new TV deal coming in, I just think it would be in everybody's worst interest to have any kind of lockout to that cost anybody any games, because I mean, that's revenue lost, and that doesn't help anybody. So I can't see that becoming an issue this time around. I think they find an agreement. Now, if we actually do hit the lockout period of July 1st, not sure, but I can't see this really kind of going into this. Like last time we lost games, I don't see that happening again because of where we're at as a league and just how everything is progressing. So I think
they're making far too much money, and they're about to make even more with the new TV deal. It would be shocking if they did. And just to do a little housekeeping on that, like you said, the December 15th was the opt-out date to opt out of the CBA. They pushed that back to February 8th, 2023. So if they opt out of the CBA, then they have to come to an agreement by June 30th of 2023. Otherwise, they're locked out. So those are the dates. Yeah. And if they stayed in it, then it would be through the 2023-2024 season.
Exactly.
They're not going to do that.
No.
So it'll be interesting, but I think that they just make too much money. It's going too well for both sides. I couldn't see that happening, but you never know.
For sure. You never know. You never
Yeah.
know. Don't take anything for granted.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that about covers it for this installment. Colin, thank you again as always. Your insights are very much appreciated when it comes
Absolutely.
to the CBA. Hope you guys have
Glad.
enjoyed this and our discussions and our explanations for these different principles. We'll be covering this all year long as that opt-out date approaches, and as we hit other important dates on the calendar. Definitely be sure to check us out. If you go to our website, notradeclause.com, we do have an NBA calendar. So that date of December 15th was highlighted in there. And then all the other important dates for the rest of this year and for 2023, pretty much all the way through the start of next season are already on our calendar. So if you're looking for an important date for some deadline or something to become available, definitely check out that website below. We got you guys covered over there. All our podcasts are over there, other resources. So definitely be sure to check us out. So guys, thank you for tuning into this installment of NTC. We'll be back next week with more coverage. We're not stopping. We're going to have guests. We're going to have more episodes coming your way. And definitely don't be sure to miss out as we get into the heat of the NBA season. So we'll catch you guys in the next installment. And until then, enjoy yourselves, and we'll see you on the next one.
Take care.